She's been an advisor to CLF for a long, long time. We're thrilled to have Dr. Ciara Dockery here with us today. She's a licensed clinical psychologist with a private practice in New York City, where she specializes in crisis intervention, trauma-informed interventions, suicide prevention, and public outreach. She also serves as the director of the NFL Lifeline, a free 24/7 emotional wellness and suicide prevention hotline for the NFL community. Dr. Dockery, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Chris. And I am also sort of just so moved by Karen's story and Noah's story. And, you know, you introduced me as an expert, but what they just did is exactly what we need to be doing to prevent suicide, to reduce stigma about reaching out for help. So I just want to thank you both so much. I do this, you know, day in and day out, and I am always just really begging people to tell their story like you both just did. So thank you for that. Like Chris said, my role is, you know, I work, and actually Chris just had the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline up. I work for an organization called Vibrant Emotional Health. We actually run the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. We also run FEMA's Disaster Distress Helpline. Those of you in New York, like me, NYC Well, which is the largest single point of access for mental health care services in crisis. And then I, like Chris said, I run the NFL Lifeline. So I work specifically in suicide prevention and crisis intervention work for current and former NFL players. And I'm gonna share my screen now. Hold on one second while I do that. Partially, sorry about that. Here we go. Okay. Part of why I do this work is that my dad, you know, my dad played in the NFL. He had 6 concussions that he knows of, that he can remember. So this is personal work for me. And I am really happy to be here today talking with you guys. So, you know, I do want to talk about suicide. We're going to talk about crisis, but, you know, I want to talk about sort of the state of suicide in our country for a second. This is often how the story is presented, right? Almost 45,000 people die by suicide a year, 750,000 hospitalizations, 1 million attempts requiring medical attention, another 2.6 million attempts that don't require medical attention, and then look at that, 12.6 million people seriously considering suicide every year. What we are doing or trying to do in the suicide prevention community, and what I want to share with you, because I really have 2 messages today. One is about how we can all prevent suicide in our community, in the CLF community, in our personal communities. But I also want you guys to come away feeling like you have the personal sort of skills and confidence to talk about this with someone you love, and you feel able to ask about it and talk about it. So this is how we often look at it, and it's a very bleak picture. However, if we sort of flip that around, and this is how I see it, you know, 12.6 million people seriously consider suicide every year, and, you know, 45,000 die by it. That means for every person that dies by suicide, 266 seriously consider it. There is a huge room in there for prevention. Something is happening in that space that is keeping those people alive, that is keeping them from acting on that. And that's really the space that I work in. That's the research we do. That's figuring out how can we really get that number to 0 at the bottom there. So I want to take a step back and talk about a little bit about our community in suicide prevention. First I want to talk about, you know, and this is stuff that Chris and CLF is already doing, but I'm sure most of you guys have heard about this sort of contagion effect, right? Like if suicide happens in a community, often the suicide rate goes up in that community. In the same way as if there's a suicide of a prominent figure and the media reports on it, we often see a spike in the suicide rate after that. And there was an amazing piece of research out of Austria where this group of researchers decided, you know what, like, let's flip that around. So what they did was next time there was a suicide in the community, rather than reporting on the suicide, what they actually did was actively push out stories of people who had struggled with suicidal ideation, how they had coped with it, how they had come through it, how they had gone on to live fulfilling, happy lives after that. So basically putting out stories of hope and recovery. And then what they were trying to do was to stop that contagion. They were trying to stop that increase that we would see following a prominent suicide attempt. And instead, what they actually saw was a decrease in suicide in that community once we put those stories out there. And to me, that is so huge. That means we actually have the power through doing things like Noah did today by telling his story about how he had these thoughts and he was able to come through it. He was able to cope. He was able to lean on his support system. Eventually was able to talk about it and ask for help. All of these stories can not only reduce stigma and whatnot, they can actually prevent suicide and actually save lives. So I want you to hear that, all of you, because everybody who is listening to this webinar can do something to prevent suicide. And so part of that is really trying to promote these stories of how people can cope and live with this. And Chris, you are doing a great job with that around CTE and post-concussion syndrome and how, you know, getting stories out there about people who live and cope and have productive, meaningful lives. And Karen, you also brought this up. You know, in the end, suicide itself is, we know in the research, it really comes down to an intense kind of loss of meaning or purpose. And the CLF community has given a lot of meaning and purpose to folks and has changed what could be kind of a degenerative brain disease without a cure to actually something that we can work with, and we can show stories of how people cope and how they can have fulfilling lives, and we can prevent suicide that way. So to take a step back, part of my work, and this is kind of what we're up against, and Chris referenced this briefly, but with athletes, there's a lot of barriers to care. That's a very clinical term, but what that means is there's a lot of reasons they don't ask for help, right? And for me, these are the things that sort of keep me up at night as a suicide prevention specialist. In this population, there's a lot of pressure to present well, right? These are high achieving folks, and this is true across other high achieving populations as well, but there's a lot of pressure to present well. And by the way, they're really good at it. As Chris talked about, you know, they can present like they're doing pretty well when they're dealing with some really intense stuff underneath. So really be mindful of that. And why that concerns me is that presenting well to the world leads to real isolation with these feelings, right? So the more we can get folks talking about these feelings, the less alone people are going to feel with them. There's that whole mental toughness thing that we instill in athletes from an early age. It's sort of like a weakness to ask for help, or they should be able to help themselves. Huge amount of shame. We know this, and stigma. A lot of athletes taught to play through pain, right? How did they, you know, they played through hitting their heads a million times, right? And through that pain, that extends to emotional pain too, that you just tough it out and you play through it. So there's a huge amount of minimizing and denying too, which further leads to isolation. And then, you know, a lot of athletes, and this is certainly true of NFL players, but I think this is true in general, often see themselves as a provider of support rather than the recipient of it. So whether that doesn't have to be sort of just financial support, that can be emotional support, or they're up on this pedestal, and it's really difficult to then flip that dynamic around and ask for help when you have been the helper for so long, potentially. And then of course, this internalized perfectionism that many of us probably struggle with, but those high standards can really create a real black and white idea of what reaching out for help means, that it means failure rather than strength, which is really how, you know, we sort of see it. So, you know, I told Chris we talk about signs of crisis. I don't like to spend too much on kind of warning signs for suicide, or really that much time on warning signs of crisis. I think the most important thing is if somebody you know or love starts acting differently than they normally do, that maybe you got to check in. Something's going on. Usually crisis, when someone's in crisis, their behavior changes. They look different. There are different signs, whether they're emotional, cognitive, physical. You know, one that's really concerning to me is that isolation. I know I've said it a lot. It might be my mantra during this, but you know, that isolating, the avoidance, not wanting people to see how poorly they might be doing is a big one, and isolation is a big risk factor for suicide. So, and then, you know, poor sleep. I know Karen referenced this. Sleep is a great barometer or temperature taker for how someone is doing, for how you are doing. You might want to check in your sleep lately, but it's also a great foot in the door, because folks are usually more comfortable talking about their sleep than they are about their feelings. So asking about sleep can often be a good sort of foot in the door in that way. As part of my work, you know, we've tried to kind of equip regular people to be able to have conversations, difficult conversations around, you know, whether it be suicide or any type of crisis. So, you know, as part of my work with the NFL, we developed this CAPE training. It's sort of the CAPE model. So it's usually a day-long training. You're gonna get like 2 minutes right now, but I can certainly connect separately on it. But basically, if you guys can remember these 4 steps, I think it'll really help in approaching these conversations. I do think people avoid asking tough questions. They avoid asking about suicide, partially because they're afraid of what they're going to hear, and they're afraid of if they can handle the answer and what are they going to do with that answer once it comes. So I'm going to go through these 4 steps, and then I'm going to spend a little bit of time specifically on what are best practices in terms of assessing for suicide risk. But, you know, the first thing you want to think of when you want to check in or have a tough conversation with somebody is really that connection piece. You know, there's a lot of research into, we look at what makes successful calls on our hotlines, like, you know, what makes for a good call, and almost always establishing that connection at the beginning. That once you have them, once they're connected to you, you can ask lots of things you wouldn't otherwise, and you can help them in a lot of ways. So part of that connection is going to be relating to them in a non-judgmental, empathic way. This part is really hard, and even as a clinician, this is hard for me. So as like a non-clinician, it'll be even harder, I think, for everyone else. But in that early stages, when you're trying to talk to someone about how they're doing, and you can tell they're struggling, we often want to jump to problem solving really quickly, right? Because we hear their pain and we love them or we care about them and we want to solve it really quick. And so we want to start throwing out suggestions, or here's what we're going to do. If you can take a breath, if you can take a step back, if you can establish like a safe space for them to just talk. A lot of times the most therapeutic thing for someone is to be heard and to be seen in what they're going through. And part of that you can also do to enhance that is to kind of paraphrase back to them what you hear. I know it sounds kind of elementary, and it's hugely impactful when someone is in crisis to hear someone reflect back what they just said. They feel heard, they feel less alone. It's a really important part. The next step in the sort of CAPE model is that sort of appraising and assessing the situation and its impact. And this can be in all domains, but I do want to talk about suicide in particular, because we've been talking about that today. You know, there's a ton of research, and I won't go into too much like dirty PhD level of it, even though this is what I, you know, love to talk about. But these are sort of the 4 core areas that we want to look at when we are concerned about someone from a suicide standpoint, right? And these are really well researched. So I'll go through each of them so you can have a better sense of kind of what you would want to explore with somebody that you're worried about when you're worried about their safety. The first is the desire for suicide. Those are the thoughts that they're having about, so that's the ideation. And encompassed in that desire is the huge amount of psychological pain that they're experiencing, the helplessness, the hopelessness, this feeling of being intolerably alone. That can be a big piece there to check in on. And one thing in that, in desire that I always want to check in, that's worrisome to me, is this idea that they feel like a burden to their loved ones. That can be a big red flag, because once somebody starts feeling like they're a burden to others, then the risk starts to go up even more. So keep that in mind too when you're talking about that. The next is their intent, right? And in intent to die involves asking about their plan. Do they have a plan? What is the method going to be? They known? And here is also some of the preparatory behaviors we talk about, where people, give away prized possessions, they say goodbye to people. These are things that oftentimes, like Karen talked about, we look back on and we can see them, but at the time, we have other reasons that we think those things might be happening. Just keep that in mind under assessing sort of for their intent. And then obviously if someone says they're going to do it and they express intent, take them seriously in that. And then the third is sort of their capability. And this goes to, they've told you their plan. Do they have access to means? Do they have the availability to go through with that plan? So if they say, if it's a firearm or medication, do they have those in the house? Because that's going to be somewhere where you can intervene to get those out of the house to keep them safe. Also around capabilities, history of previous attempts. We know that makes risk higher, and that's primarily because, for lack of a better word, suicide, unfortunately, it's hard to do. And sometimes there's this sort of practice effect or this desensitization that happens through multiple attempts that makes it more possible in the end. And then again, like we've talked about, exposure to somebody else's death by suicide is also something that will sort of increase their capability to act on it. And then this last one that I want to talk about, and I'm mindful of the time, so I will be quick on these, but is really, and we don't remember to do this sometimes, but to assess for kind of what are their reasons for living still? What are their buffers that they haven't? I often ask, like, wow, you've been feeling all of this, but you haven't acted on it. What has kept you from acting on this plan? And there's going to be a great point where you can reinforce, because a lot of times those are going to be people they love in their life. They never do it for their kids. It could be around faith or core values that they, a sense of purpose, right? And if you can reinforce those things, engaging with you. I tell our crisis counselors, if they're talking to you about their suicide, part of them wants to live. So you're talking to the part of them that wants to live. So really reinforcing any planning they have for the future, all of that, and their social supports and immediate supports, and connecting them to those is going to be important. So in this space, we got to get comfortable asking the actual question. That might actually take practice. We're not used to asking this, but you got to figure out how you're going to spit it out and ask it. So that I think that a lot of the way I do it often is reflect back. Sometimes when people are in as much pain as you're telling me, they start to think about suicide. Is that something you've thought about? Rather than saying, you're not thinking about suicide, right? I mean, those are two different ways. So find what's natural for you. And I think I went through these, and I'm mindful of time, but you want to ask about, how they would do it, they intend to do it, do they have the means to carry out, and what's kept them safe in the past, and if they've had past attempts. So again, in the CAPE model, from there, you would go through problem solving. That really needs to be collaborative. It can't be your idea of what's going to help them. You got to find out what they feel capable of doing, and making it a collaborative effort to get them to the next step and to keep them safe and to get those means out of their house. And then lastly, there's this engagement, and that's engagement. The E is really to engage them to a resource. You are not going to be the end all resource for them. You are going to be the hand that holds them to the person that they need and the treatment potentially that they need. So, and then also in that engagement, and Chris said this, there's a lot of research around follow-up. Following up with folks is huge. In a study with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline with 625 suicidal callers who received one follow-up call, 80% of them in a survey after said that call contributed to them not acting on their plan. Of the 80% that said that, 50% said that call was the reason they didn't go through with their plan. So like, think about that for a second. A stranger calling them to check in was the reason they didn't act on their plan. So as Chris said earlier, you cannot check in enough. You cannot follow up enough. If anything, they'll tell you you're bothering them or whatever, but the follow-up is really huge. So again, these resources, Chris talked about the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, Concussion Legacy. If there are any folks from the NFL family, NFL Lifeline is an independent, confidential, free, 24/7 resource. You can also go to Be the One Too to get this is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline's plan and campaign as to how to help folks in suicide, and everyone can do something to prevent it. And again, for our community, I love these webinars for really trying to reinforce kind of meaning and purpose in folks' lives and to hold the hope. And so the more folks can tell their positive stories of hoping, of resilience, recovery, hope, and healing, the more we can do to prevent suicide.